This is the Prana and Poetry Pod, Episode 6, Decolonizing Your Spiritual Business. Yes, I am soft as snow and tender of bones, but I will not speak gently, for I have fire in my belly, a dragon in my throat. There's a debt to collect. My primal breath will shake you yet. Imagine for a moment your business reflects your body and your mind is the colonizer. What if you're showing up as the colonizer in your own business, pushing yourself really hard, not allowing rest? You're constantly criticizing yourself and you're operating in this overly masculine, imbalanced energy. There's a bully in you that operates from a harsh place, and you feel entitled to say hurtful things to yourself. There's no consistency or structure to your business. You just pick and choose what to work on as you please. You're not actually getting anywhere, but you're driven by the need to make a profit. So again, you operate from this desperate and often aggressive place. Now imagine behaving this way to another individual. Worse, to an individual who comes from the culture your business is created from. Imagine behaving this way to an entire culture, a culture that despite multiple genocides over centuries is still living and holding on to their sacred knowledge and traditions. Knowledge that you're claiming as your own, despite it having nothing to do with your heritage or cultural belonging to the land of the spiritual knowledge that you've taken an interest in. Imagine teaching this knowledge in its watered down, corrupted and distorted state. And on top, not having any connection to those who actually come from the culture, not having any relationships, friendships, no tie to its living community. Imagine this person from the source culture comes into your class or online offering and experiences a trigger, or they are re-traumatized by a coach, leader, or teacher whose ancestors were colonizers who behaved in the same way. In the way of entitlement, arrogance, poor knowledge, and poor pronunciations of language, poor understanding of concepts and rituals that are used out of context. Only this carrier of the culture can see the distortion of the truth that is in their DNA. Epigenetics show that we can experience intergenerational trauma or harm our ancestors felt in our bodies through a trigger from a similar experience that is happening in the present. Creating a spiritual business based off other people's cultures, done in an ignorant way, is not only very offensive, it is very harmful. So 2 questions. Number 1, how are you showing up as the colonizer in your own business? Number 2, what harm are you participating in towards the descendants or inheritors of the indigenous practice that you're basing your business on? And to be clear, these questions are also towards those from the original culture, because we are all colonized. My first ick was in realizing how I myself was perpetuating colonization of my own cultural tradition by going along with the farce of the Western yoga industry, jumping on political bandwagons which had nothing to do with yoga. If you can't already tell, I've found my calling. I am deeply passionate about decoloniality, living life in the opposite to the toxic colonial culture which poisons all aspects of life, from business to personal relationships. This path is about unlearning harm and the oppression that came from invaders and imperialists, and relearning indigenous ways of being. And the common factor of the indigenous is their sacred relationship to nature, land, and community. All spiritual trends in business are based on pagan or indigenous culture. In our capitalist world, knowledge is extracted from here and commodified. Those who benefit from these extractions are also the same people who are doing the extracting for profit. And those from the original culture are left out. Something to consider as you create your spiritual business is who benefits and who is left out. Where does the colonizer and colonized show up in your business? Another way to say this is, where is the bully and where is the victim? Are we showing up as both when we craft our business and when we're presenting the offering itself? Please see episode 3 of my podcast on narcissism and colonialism to see how this ego-led identity forms the very structure of our society and the way we operate individually. I recommend listening to this part to identify what the markers are of a colonizer. Where I get triggered in social media and in online or in-person classes is the entitlement from teachers who are very obviously not from the source culture. There is a sense of superiority over knowledge and wisdom that has been attained through theft of land and ideas. There is a sense of entitlement over the language, the butchered Sanskrit, for example, in mantras, bhajans, and simply in the names of yoga postures. Violation of our language, customs, and practices has a visceral effect in our bodies as people from the source culture. It is re-traumatizing. Please don't forget our history of genocide and ethnocide, which is still ongoing. And if you don't know this, it's deeply ignorant. It's time for education. Because as so-called yoga teachers, living the yamas and niyamas means we are living and acting responsibly. Nothing is sacred to the colonized mind and body. And what is even more sinister is that Sanskrit is even being weaponized as something that is oppressive. So the self-hatred cultivated in Hindus can continue, so we can continue to feel alienated from our own inheritance. And yet, interestingly, those not from the culture are free to chant Om or use Sanskrit terminology in their classes. I experience this regularly. White yoga teachers freely opening or closing classes with chanting. Yet as someone who is indigenous to the practice, I experience pushback. I am shut down before I can even use my voice. Namaste is associated with Hindu culture. It's not related to yoga practice. It's to do with our living culture. Indian Hindus say it because it's part of our way of life. If you want to use this gesture from the living culture of the Vedas, the Hindus, why do you separate yoga from the Hindus or the Hindu practice that is yoga? I find this delusion perplexing, rage-invoking, and the most idiotic logic. By the way, there is so much nuance and debate over this term because the lived experience of the Indian diaspora is different from the lived experience of those born in the land of yoga, which is Bharat. Those of us from the diaspora feel a deep cringe when non-Indian people not only mispronounce it, but use it in a fabricated context. There's a lot of charge behind this word because we've grown up with racism and rejection of our words and clothes and customs by the dominant culture, only for those who bullied us to now claim it in order to add exotification to their new age spiritual business. In a capitalist economy, it adds to their value and revenue. What hurts is that this is done without empathy or understanding of the consequences to the carriers of the source culture. I love asana-inspired movement. I appreciate the teachers who lead these classes skillfully. However, what I don't appreciate is the picking and choosing from our culture and customs and throwing it into gym-style classes like decoration, like adding the cringy mispronounced Sanskrit and the worst horror, calling the students yogis. Ugh, I feel violated. I'm not actually kidding. It affects me viscerally. You claim to be a 500+ hour yoga teacher, yet you have no concept of what a yogi is. You have an Indian person or brown girl in your class and you say namaste and yogis with arrogance and entitlement as if you know what you're talking about. It's pure ego. Your ignorance is showing. I'm actually embarrassed for you. And it reveals to me the extent of your learning or lack of learning. It's clear that there is no Indigenous steward in your many Western certification trainings. And I imagine this is a similar experience for all people from Indigenous cultures or those who have a strong connection to their roots and their practices, like Native Americans or Aboriginal Australians, even those seeking to reconnect to their stolen land, medicines and traditions. Decolonizing your spiritual business means to demonstrate respect of the origins of the teachings. Be authentic in what you know and don't know. Don't teach what you don't know or understand. A painful truth is that we shouldn't be making sales from a culture that has been colonized and harmed. Yet, we are all here. We all participate in it. It's not going to stop, so we find a respectful way forward instead, doing the least amount of harm. If the practices you're using for your business is not derived from your heritage, you are a guest in someone else's culture. Unless you are showing up with respect and humility, you'll be cutting off serving the very people who need the wholeness of their cultural medicine back. I suppose my main point here is that we must show up in our business with some responsibility and integrity. I myself am still learning. I am in process, and I honor my anger, my grief, my hurt, and that wise part of me that wishes to lead with strength, compassion, and integrity. Thank you for joining me on this week's episode. I feel like there is a lot more to add to this topic, and so I'll see you for part 2 next week in the final episode of this series on dharma and decoloniality. I'm Payal. If you like this episode, subscribe for more. Rise up, warrior.